Hi, my name is Stanislav Kostyuk, and this is Farlands, a series about video games and video game design. And today's topic is the contradictive experience of For Honor's Faction War. For Honor is a game I've been waiting for many years before it has ever been announced without even knowing it. I always was interested in a melee fighting game focused on a more realistic representation of historical combat, where you need to think about your and enemy stances, and the battles have more meditation and crunch to them. For Honor delivers this experience. I'm thoroughly enjoying its core gameplay and multiplayer. However, one of the things that has really interested me when I started For Honor was the concept of the faction war metagame, a concept that I stopped caring about just after one round. In this video, I'm going to analyze what I find problematic with the faction war. First, however, let's take a look at what faction war is. This video from the game explains it pretty sufficiently.
The faction war is the persistent cross-platform conflict between the knights, Vikings, and samurai. The faction you have pledged allegiance to determines who you'll fight for in the faction war, but doesn't stop you from playing any available hero. The faction war englobes all multiplayer and bot activities. After each match, you'll be awarded war assets based on your personal performance. You can deploy war assets to help conquer an enemy territory, or defend one of yours against opposing factions. On a global level, the faction war is divided into territory updates, rounds, and seasons. Territory updates occur every 6 hours, while rounds last 2 weeks and seasons last 10 weeks. For each territory update, the faction with the most war assets on a specific territory controls it. The world map will display the new faction-controlled territories and move the different fronts. Fronts will define which map you will play on. A map that was controlled by the knights and is now controlled by the samurai will have many visible changes. At the end of each round, players who participated will get a reward depending on the rank of their faction in that round. Once the season ends, everyone will get rewards depending on the rank of their faction. At the end of each season, the faction war is reset and will resume after an off-season period. The world will forever be impacted by what happened in the previous seasons of For Honor.
Sounds pretty cool, right? However, in the end, faction war turned out to be pretty problematic. There are two essential issues. First, faction war has design that on one hand tries not to get into the way of the player experience, while at the same time preventing them from assisting in the war their preferred way. Second, faction war and actual gameplay systems have a big disconnect in terms of atmosphere and theming, making participation in the war less compelling. Let's start examining all the different parts of it and what are the issues exactly. We start with faction choice. When you first start the game, you get to choose one of the factions, knights, samurai, or Vikings. You can still use any hero from any of the factions regardless of your choice, and if you want, in the future can switch your faction, although with a penalty regarding rewards from a round or season. This instantly poses a question: why the metagame factions and character factions are one and the same? I understand the thought behind not wanting to restrict heroes, that if you select knights, you wouldn't want to be blocked from other characters. While on one hand, blocking would make the choice more meaningful, and it would reinforce the Knights vs Vikings vs Samurai concept, at the start you don't know which hero you like gameplay-wise. And even if you've played for some time, you'd still probably want to see how it feels to play other types of warriors. But the fact that Faction War Select is choose if you want to be a Knight, Samurai or Viking, but don't worry, you'll be able to use any Knight, Samurai or Viking characters anyway, makes the choice between these particular factions meaningless. The idea is that each faction has a different definition of what honor is, but this can be easily applied to factions with different names, and framing that each one has followers with different viewpoints from several orders of warriors across the world. It's not as striking an image as Knights vs Vikings vs Samurai, but it will keep the experience consistent and wholesome. Now let's talk about frontlines. The selection of play modes in For Honor happens in a pretty cool fashion, directly on the world map where you essentially choose the battle frontline. It is, however, somewhat weird from atmospheric perspective. The thing is, all modes are categorized in 3 groups. 1. Duel and Brawl. 2. Skirmish and Elimination. 3. Dominion. As there are 3 factions, there are 3 frontlines, and each of mode groups is placed on one of them. However, you can choose any mode at any time, so that means that you can be a samurai who just hops in on the Knights vs Vikings frontline, and in terms of the metagame fantasy, that sometimes can feel weird. The advantage, of course, is that it keeps the pool of all players for a mode in the same place. If it first choose a frontline and then any of the available modes, then we'd have 2 player pools for each mode. However, while I would argue that the latter provides a better metagame experience, it's not an issue as long as matchmaking principles are updated. There are mechanical problems with the frontlines though related to war assets, which I'll talk about in a bit. First, we'll take a look at matchmaking. Once we choose a mode, we start it. It takes just your skill and region into account. This is an issue as there are no prioritizations based on chosen faction. On one hand, that's understandable, matchmaking based on skill, region and faction would be longer. On another hand, a lot of times that feels bad in the context of the faction war because frequently you're fighting against people of your own faction. The reason why it feels bad is because war assets that you receive for faction war are based on your personal performance, and if you keep killing a person from your own faction, for example, their performance is worse, so they get less points. I clearly remember one match where I, a person who chose the Knight faction, was in a team with 3 people from Samurai faction, and the opposing team had 3 Knights and 1 Samurai. Our team was very successful that match, and I essentially helped my rival in faction in getting more war assets. So the fact that matchmaking doesn't take into account factions actually makes it harder for people to be effective in the metagame as a group. To improve the faction war experience and feeling, you'd have to matchmake in a way so that players of one faction wouldn't have to fight their own faction in opposing team. That means that one team would always have to consist of one faction only, while a second team could consist of either 1 or 2 opposing-only factions. But that's not all. There's also mob factions. In 2 of the game modes, Dominion and Skirmish, the map has AI-controlled mobs, which are grunt soldiers of a certain faction. As far as I understand, the choice of factions these mobs belong to depends on the frontline areas that we're fighting in. For example, if Dominion is happening on the Knights vs Viking frontline, then the mobs will belong to Knights and Viking factions. This makes sense on its own, but it doesn't in the context of all other faction war systems in place. Here's an example of a situation I've participated in. Dominion was in the Knights vs Samurai frontline. The team I was in had everyone from Knight faction. The enemy team consisted of all who chose the Vikings. However, the game placed my team with the Samurai mobs, while Vikings got the Knight mobs, so I was killing soldiers of my own faction. While this doesn't matter in mechanical context, it's a thing that negatively affects the faction war experience just like it does with players. It doesn't feel right to fight against what are supposed to be your allies, this hurts the fantasy. Now let's get to war asset distribution. So, when you receive war assets for completing a match, there are 2 specifics you have to keep in mind. You can deploy war assets only on territories where your faction is fighting in, even though, as discussed in the frontline section, a mode you'd like to play might not have your faction fighting there. In this case, you need to assign assets to a frontline from other mode. This wouldn't be a problem, but you get a war asset bonus if the territory you're sending them to is corresponding to the mode you just finished. This is the mechanical issue with the way frontlines and mode selection are implemented that I've mentioned before. Let's say you're a Viking who loves duel mode. If the duel mode happens to be on the Knight vs Samurai frontline, playing your favorite mode will affect your faction's performance in a negative way, as you won't provide those mode war asset bonuses. Similar situation is when you have a daily order or contract to complete in a mode on a frontline where your faction is not fighting. There is also another bonus with war assets that you get close to the end of a territory update cycle, but I actually think that it's fine and not very problematic. I would like to talk about territories though. I remember seeing a faction war guide where the writer advises to put war assets only on territories where their control is 50-50 or 49-51, because these types of territories are the ones with the highest chance to keep them or conquer them. There's no other decision making involved, because territories is just a number. There is no reason, for example, to sacrifice one territory because another one is too strategically important. You just care if you have one more territory, any territory. Every territory should at least provide some sort of bonus to all other metagame systems of the faction that controls it. That can be XP bonus, steal bonus, loot amount bonus. Even having those things would make it sting when you lose some territories. But maybe, although this would require a lot of thought put into it when it comes to details, territories could provide bonuses that affect gameplay as well. For example, let's say that some feats would be disabled for you unless your faction controls a specific territory. There could be 2 territories in the world map that enable a catapult feat. Let's say those are the territories with best catapult manufacturers, so to speak. So the state of the faction war would directly influence your matches not just in terms of cosmetics, but gameplay as well, therefore increasing its significance and the desire to control different territories. And each territory update would also be more exciting as it would keep changing the gameplay possibilities. Now that I've mentioned territory updates, I would like to note that most of them don't actually matter in the metagame. The faction that wins the round is decided based on the amount of owned territories after the final territory update of the round. I don't even know if war assets have any significance, as in the round 2 of Season 1, the Samurai faction deployed the most war assets in total, but it had the fewest territories at the end, so it was rank 3. This means that, for example, your faction can be absolutely dominant for 50 out of 56 territory updates, and then in those last 6 updates you lose everything and you're in the last spot. It doesn't help that the territory update doesn't provide any, even little, rewards to the factions currently in the lead. The time of the territory update, 6 hours, is also questionable. Because of the faction wars worldwide, a lot of players miss quite a bit of territory updates, either because of work, sleep, or other personal life matters and the way they spend their free time. I think it would make sense for it to be at least 12 hours, but maybe 24 would be even better, as then if you play daily, you'll have a chance to affect a territory update regardless of your schedule. And now we get to metagame participation. Inside For Honor, when it comes to faction war metagame, the only thing that you see are war assets. You don't see, for example, who from your faction has assigned the most war assets per zoner in total. You don't get any additional rewards depending on how much you've participated in the faction war. There is really no incentive to participate in it on a larger scale, except those last few territory update rounds to try and get the faction to rank 1. Now, I would like to note that at the time I'm recording this, it's only the end of Season 1 Round 4. There's still one round in the season, and maybe there's something planned for that moment. We'll see. However, that doesn't fix the issue that players don't feel the importance of participation during all of these rounds. There's also no way to communicate with your or other factions inside the game. I will say that faction communication design would be tricky. Because faction war is cross-platform, communication would have to be done just with preset messages to comply with console manufacturers' rules. That said, the only way to somehow try to coordinate or communicate your faction actions, like where your allies have to focus their war assets on, or trying to get a temporary truce with one of the factions to fight against the one with too many territories under control, is via traditional means like forum or Reddit, which are places where only a small subset of the player base goes to. And with no communication involved, faction war becomes just people doing something with war assets hoping that they'll eventually win the round. So these are the issues with the faction war. It's an interesting concept, but in an attempt to both make it matter and be optional, not that noticeable, the game has a metagame system that's at odds with itself, both mechanically and atmospherically, which creates a weird experience. I actually started enjoying the game even more once I stopped caring about the faction war and looked at all multiplayer matches as just random conflicts without any thematic wrapper around it. So here's how we'll propose to fix the faction war. Step 1. Separate the metagame factions and character factions and rename the metagame factions. This removes the contradiction between faction choice and full roster of characters being available for anyone. Step 2. Have matchmaking set up in a way that one team has to fully belong to one faction. Step 3. This leads to a question of what to do with friends grouping from different factions. There are plenty of possible solutions for this, each with advantages and disadvantages, but I will not focus on this part for now. Step 4. As long as matchmaking works with faction prioritization, no changes have to be made to the frontline system. It should be fine to leave it as it is, with each frontline being a group of modes. It might be a little weird, but fighting against your own is a bigger problem than some stragglers, so to speak, grouping up together with another faction. Step 5. Create 3 new texture sets for mobs, one for each new metagame faction, and have it so mobs are also a mix of knights, samurai and vikings, just like the players will be. This would reinforce the fantasy that each faction is a mix of warriors from different orders. Step 6. Make sure that the team consisting of fully one faction gets mobs of the corresponding faction assigned to it if we're playing Dominion or Skirmish mode. Step 7. Remove the war asset bonus for game modes. Let people freely choose with which mode they'd want to help their faction in the war. Step 8. Add rewards to territory updates to keep players engaged throughout the round. Step 9. Increase territory update time to 24 hours. With these changes, the faction war experience would transform from one where systems don't properly connect to each other to one where you really feel like you and everybody who chose your faction fight together in an attempt to turn the tide of the conflict, both in terms of gameplay and atmosphere. You might have noticed I didn't say anything about highlighting participation in the metagame or communication within or between factions. While I do believe it's a problem that these are not in, they're also not the priority number one fixes, and it's very important to rethink the way round winners are decided, but that takes time, and adding rewards to territory updates is going to give some. Regardless, whatever the 4 on our team decides to do, I really hope that they're looking close at the faction war and are planning to make some changes, as right now it's just a strange and, in my opinion, meaningless appendix to a pretty great multiplayer title. Thank you all for watching. Feel free to leave any comments below. If you'd like to keep an eye on my future videos, please subscribe, or feel free to follow me on Twitter at Farlander1991. And if you'd like, consider supporting my work on Patreon. I would like to have a special thank you mention to my first patron, Paolo Di Stefano. Hope I pronounced your name correct. Your support means a lot. Thank you, and thank you to everybody who has watched the video. I hope you enjoyed it.